Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jane McDonald, a proud board member at the Transition Accelerator and Vice President of Climate and Nature Solutions. I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you all to the webinar. Before I introduce our panel, I do want to acknowledge that the Transition Accelerator, with staff across many provinces, acknowledges the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live. We recognize and respect the ongoing relationships that Indigenous peoples have to the land, and we commit to the ongoing process of reconciliation. When it comes to addressing climate change, one of the most critical challenges we face is discerning effective long-term strategies from those that seem beneficial in the short term, but ultimately lead us down dead-end pathways. How do we navigate this complex landscape without wasting precious time and resources? Well, that's the question we're going to explore here today. And I am delighted to have Dr. James Meadowcroft with us. He is a pathway principal at the Accelerator and will guide us through the intricacies of long-term transition pathways versus short-sighted victories. Dr. Meadowcroft will be joined in conversation today by Transition Accelerator Vice President Moe Kabbara. And we encourage you all to share your questions for both Moe and James in the Q&A box below. And so without further ado, I wish you all a great conversation and pass it over to you, Mo.
Thanks, Jane. And good morning, everyone, or wherever you may be. It's noon here on the East Coast, or Eastern time. So we're very happy to be having this conversation with James. So as Jane mentioned, my name is Moe Kabbara. I'm Vice President of the Transition Accelerator and joined here by James, who is one of our pathway principals. And, we really want to kind of kick off the conversation pretty quickly here, James, just for the sake of time. So we're here today to talk about dead-end pathways. And just to kind of get us started, I want to ask, what do you mean when you say dead-end pathway?
Hi, Mo. Nice to be here with you. So I think basically the idea is that we understand the dead-end pathway to be one that cannot achieve ultimately the desired goals that we have. And in this case, we're talking about transitions to net zero. So kind of saying that in slightly different words, a dead-end pathway doesn't really contribute to the goal of system transformation to give us different systems, adjusted systems that are capable of delivering net zero and other desirable social features. So again, what I think we can see is that there are many technologies and approaches that can deliver emissions reductions, but not all of them actually contribute to making the large-scale changes needed to reach net zero.
So at the bottom of this, really, we're talking about the idea of system transformation, which seems to be critical to understanding the dead-end pathway. So I know this has been very much, your specialty or area of research, studying transitions, studying systemic transformations. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, like to kind of really contextualize the idea of dead-end pathway within the concept of the system transformation?
Yeah, absolutely. You put your finger on the kind of critical thing. And we at the Transition Accelerator really emphasize the fact that to tackle climate change, we actually need to transform the large-scale systems of social provisioning on which our society depends. And I should say that this isn't just like a Transition Accelerator thing. Prominent international organizations like the IPCC and the IEA also agree that systems transformation is required to address climate change. So how can we see this really simply? Well, the first thing, of course, is the energy system, which still remains about 75 to 80% dependent on fossil fuels. So we need that energy to power our society. But also, GHGs are released from other processes, particularly, I would say, the kind of materials on which the basic materials on which industrial civilization depends. Think about things like cement, steel, chemicals. All of these involve, they're very GHG intensive in their production. but also agriculture. So it's not just how we build our society, how we power our society, but also how we eat is highly dependent on GHG emitting processes at the present time, particularly animal agriculture and fertilizers, which we need removing those GHG emissions, if you like, requires a transformation of all of those things: energy system, materials production, agriculture, and so on. So it requires change across multiple systems, and it requires quite fundamental change. Now, you mentioned that I work a lot on transitions, and this is basically understanding how society goes through changes in these large-scale systems. Like, how do we get from horses to automobiles? How has the digital revolution unfolded? How did we electrify society? How did we move from sailing ships to steamships, and so on? And there are lots of lessons from those processes, but basically what we can see is that these systems mostly evolve rather gradually, but occasionally they go through significant leaps. So you can think the motor car has changed a lot since the Model T Ford, but an internal combustion engine car is in many ways also similar, as it's a family resemblance to a descendant of the Model T. But now we're moving a leap to electric vehicles, which is a much more profound change. So in order to tackle with these emissions from the energy system and so on, they're so deeply embedded in our basic systems, like how we move around, how we heat our buildings, how agriculture works, and so on, that we really need one of these larger scale leaps in each of these systems, regionally, sectorally, in order to deal with climate change. And the word pathways, or how we understand pathways, very much relates to, they are pathways to this sort of transformation in the particular sector, in the particular region, and so on. So the pathways link where we need to go, a desirable vision of a society, a system that is net zero, with a good understanding of where we actually are today. So dead-end pathways are those that don't contribute to that deeper transition of the system, the moving of system to a situation where it doesn't produce GHGs. So on this understanding, the change, if you like, dealing with climate change isn't kind of like a pollution control issue. It's much more an issue of changing the basic systems that are giving rise to these GHG emissions. And dead-end pathways are actually taking us away from that effort.
And James, you have a very good visual to kind of demonstrate that. I'm going to pop it up here, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
And
yeah, so this we kind of call this the mountain diagram, and some of you may have seen it before. I think actually it was David Lazelle who first developed this slide. And what you see is the little hiker. She's starting up the mountain trail. She sees the big mountain. And the problem is that taking the first turning on the left kind of leads you up to this dead-end pathway that looks like you're making progress. It looks like you're dealing with the problem, in our case, reducing emissions. But actually, when you get to the top, you realize that, my goodness, I'm not, I have to go back down in order to get up the mountain. And that's what this visual tries to capture.
And can you give us like an example of something that you've seen us do at this, at a societal level or in terms of dealing with specific sectors?
Yeah, so I mean, an example that I think is in some way the most straightforward is the idea of ethanol, particularly grain-based ethanol, as a solution for the light-duty vehicle sector. And it's true that 20 years ago, people said, well, maybe biofuels will power our transport in the future. But it is very clear today that ethanol and also blending ethanol and gasoline as kind of an intermediary stage is not the future of light duty transport. By this I mean light duty vehicles like cars and pickup trucks and vans and things like that. We've seen clearly now that battery electric vehicles have undergone a massive development, improvement in functionality, reduction in costs that show that the vision for light duty vehicles is going to be electrification. And in fact, industry has moved in that way. And unless you think that they're going to be tearing down all these battery plants in 15 years, it's clear that that's the future of. So blending ethanol and gasoline and spending subsidies and money to build ethanol capacity and keep on this is really a dead-end pathway. And I should mention that a number of provinces still in their climate plans, this ethanol blending is making the most important contribution to emissions reduction by 2030. And it's just a waste of resources.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, James. And ultimately, what you're saying is that we're not really investing in the system that is going to be there in 2050, that's going to enable us to really go to zero, right? Like, so we can reduce emissions, but we're not going to get to zero with this kind of solution.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, or near zero, I guess. Put it that way.
Yes.
Okay. So I mean, I think this is kind of brings us back to the point, because we're defining dead-end pathways with respect to net zero. So the top of the mountain, right? Like what is our longer term target? But like, what are some other things that really make a pathway undesirable or impractical beyond just its ability to meet to meet a net zero future?
So Mo, what I'd say is that there are lots of reasons that we might not want to take a particular pathway. So we might find one pathway is more expensive than another, or we might say, oh, that's going to increase social inequity, or whatever. But we really confine the term dead-end pathway to pathways that cannot meet the fundamental decarbonization objective of getting to net zero. Otherwise, what you find happens is people start just throwing the term around and say, oh, that's a dead end. So I've got colleagues that don't like nuclear power and they think it's too risky and not very good and very expensive. So they just say, oh, nuclear power is a dead end pathway. Or other people maybe they don't like CCS. So they say CCS is a dead end pathway, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of arguing that we really keep this term for a specific kind of pathway, those which cannot scale or for other reasons cannot really be part of implementing an overall net zero solution. And of course, it's sector specific. I mean, there's no point just throwing things out as dead end. You have to say, in the light vehicle sector, biofuels are not the answer, and investing in them heavily is a dead end pathway.
Yeah, I mean, so keeping up with that mountain analogy, would you say then it's like basically there may be one pathway where it's like really you have a nice trail, it's cleared up for you, you're just walking up, and one that it has a lot more challenges, and by both of them are going to lead to the top, but like one of them's you might have to cut a tree on the way to keep going.
Yeah, I mean they could lead to the top. I mean the rough and ready distinctions that I use are that we have priority pathways. Those are things that we really know we're going to have to do at scale, and we know how to do it and where we should be focusing our effort. And then potential pathways that are things that might pan out and be really good, and they're worth investing in now, but we don't know exactly how much they'll cost or how much of the load they'll take. And then dead-end pathways that just are essentially a waste of resources.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really good point, and I guess that's kind of brings me to kind of the next question I had in mind, which is the waste of resources, but also ultimately what's wrong? Like why are dead-end pathways such a problem for us in this transition?
So, I mean, fundamentally, they slow down progress towards the system level transformation that's required to address the climate problem. They waste resources because you put money into something that ultimately you're going to have to undo or abandon as you go forward. They delay the transition. In other words, they slow the mobilization of investment and effort, regulation, and so on. That is required to push this larger scale transformation. They confuse investors and so on. So it's not just that they're kind of a distraction. It's that or they don't get us where we need to go. They're actually slowing us down from getting where we need to go. And I had a couple of slides, Mo, that kind of maybe illustrate this point.
Yeah.
So what you see here, so thanks to Danny Rosenblum for helping develop these slides. I'm going to show you 3 slides that they're conceptual slides that kind of offer 3 different choices of investment strategy and regulatory strategy and so on. The first one, which is the good case, okay, which is what you see here is the on the left-hand scale is the GHG emissions from, here we're doing with personal transport, the ethanol example that I gave. And the 2 things that you're doing are propagating battery electric vehicles whose emissions reductions are reflected in the green line that says EVs. And the other alternative is that you are blending ethanol in gasoline and maybe even increasing that blending over time. And what you see is that at first, the blending of ethanol and gasoline, which means all cars are a small percentage of their emissions are reduced, gives you a bigger emissions profile. But as the fleet switches over, since an EV is 100%, virtually emissions reduction compared to the 5% or 10% that you're getting with the ethanol, very quickly the rollover in the fleet eclipses that achieved by the ethanol blending. And after the point that the EVs are kind of accelerating, it's clear that were you to put more money into building ethanol capacity and blending it and so on, you are in fact would be reducing resources. But here you see kind of here we've put where we are now, where the EV acceleration is just beginning. And the 2 bars across there show you what is the net zero compatible range, i.e. how much emissions you'd actually have to reduce to get to net zero, and the potential scalability limit of a dead end pathway. So in the ethanol case, it's related to our ability to produce biofuels in the ridiculous quantities you would need to replace all gasoline. And that runs into land use problems because we need the land for other things like food production, perhaps carbon sequestration, or the use of biofuels for other things where they may be more valuable than in transport fuels. So this is actually, the good case, and it's hoping that we very quickly now wind down this ethanol program. So the next slide, here you see that we delay and we put more effort into blending, as actually some provinces in Canada seem to want to do. So we get some more reductions over time from the ethanol, but we're wasting massively our resources. And you'll notice that the curve for the uptake of the EVs and the achieving net zero has moved to the right because we're delaying, slowing it down as we move forward. And finally, the last slide shows you kind of like the really bad situation. This is world 3. If we can, yeah, where you see that we've actually, reached the peak of the dead end. We're running out of biomass and other conflicts even before we get the real pathway, which in this case is electrification, off the ground.
This is really interesting, James. So ultimately, you're showing, the wasted resources that could have gone into the ultimate solution here. And I guess my question, and it's kind of all goes back to actually pathway, being able to identify the priority pathway, distinguish it from the dead end pathway, and ultimately identifying the priority pathway is what some might call picking winners, right? So, and often we hear, the governments are not good at this, and there's sort of a hesitation with picking winners. And by ruling out some pathways, you're removing sort of the option for the market or companies or consumers to make that choice. So I'm curious, how do you deal with that kind of problem of picking winners in this context?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, this debate is quite complicated, and people use the idea of picking winners to mean slightly different things. And of course, we don't want to pick winners like we'd give the contract to the brother-in-law of the minister or something like that, picking individual companies. But governments have always favored and directed investment in areas where they think the most growth or the most opportunities lie. Even when people have said, well, we shouldn't be picking winners. As a colleague of mine, sometimes said, Bruce Laurie, governments that don't pick winners become losers. But in any case, this really here is not so much about picking winners as weeding out losers. That's to say, identifying areas where social investment will be wasted, both government support, but also potentially private sector investment, because it's kind of being put into an area which may look politically appealing, but actually analysis shows can't deliver the goods on the net zero transition.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there's a risk. You could, in principle, declare something, a dead end and not invest in it, and 30 years later, it could have some remarkable breakthrough. But right now, the problem is much more that there are things that are clearly losers that we are putting money to, and it's distracting effort from the much more promising areas.
That's a really good point, James. And we were part of one of our initiatives at Transition Accelerator is Electrifying Canada, and we were going around the country convening stakeholders for each province. And one of the things that kind of we were asking people, like, what are some of all regret actions or all regret options, right? Like, we know that there's going to be nothing but regret there, and it sounds like not necessarily equating that 100% with dead end pathway, but there seems to be a lot of overlap with that definition.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Yeah, what you're saying there is that if somebody says we need to generate electricity by having everybody bike on, everybody go to this like centralized place where everybody cycles and generates electricity versus like trying to see whether it's going to be nuclear, gas with carbon capture, solar, wind. It's very easy to pick out the loser in that situation versus kind of picking the winner, right?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, your example is a bit obvious.
Luckily,
there are no government programs that are financing those electric exercise bikes.
Yes.
But there are areas where we continue to invest in things that really are not helping system transformation, whether it be a technology or a particular behavior or a new business model or something like that.
Yeah, but again, emphasizing that a dead end pathway is not you can't just use that for a pathway you don't like or you think it has other problems.
Yes, exactly. And we'll argue about the advantages and disadvantages of particular technologies, and there are trade-offs undoubtedly. Sometimes we may actually decide to do something that's a bit more expensive because it avoids some other problem. And those are normal and they'll unfold in the course of the transition. But if we can identify some of these dead-end pathways, it definitely will speed up our overall efforts.
Yeah. And any in terms of the sectors that are sort of at risk of being slowed down by land pathways, you mentioned transportation. Any other ones that you feel are kind of important, or they're less susceptible, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think transport. It just so happens because our dependence on fossil fuels is so high in transport, I think it's particularly susceptible to it. So, I mean, another example that you might use would be using natural gas for heavy vehicles. So heavy vehicles, like particularly Class 8 and so on, are a real problem. Batteries are heavy. The technology maybe isn't quite there yet for for many usages. So there are some suggestions. Oh, well, let's use natural gas for the next 15 or 20 years till hydrogen fuel cell vehicles mature, or till battery electric get better. But I would be very loath to see significant investment and or public money put into transforming, putting vehicles as a temporary solution onto compressed natural gas. We would actually be much better taking those resources and accelerating the development of potentially solutions that would work, such as hydrogen fuel cells and so on. Mm-hmm. I think some other examples, maybe from the building sector, you could suggest that the use of biogas for buildings for heating might be another place that we would be wasting investment, because again, the scale suggests there's just not enough. We'd be scraping North America clean of bioresources, and we maybe need those resources for other things.
What about like capturing carbon at the building level?
Yeah, okay. So I know there's an example of in New York where there's a building that they put a CCS plant, little CCS capture unit in the building, and then they're sending it across town by truck to a cement manufacturer that's included. So I think that, yeah, if anybody's seriously proposing that as a solution to the whole building sector, I would say it's a dead end.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I mean, you raise a good point there, James, in terms of the using natural gas in heavy duty, or even using ethanol in light duty vehicles can reduce emissions, right? So most people would agree at this point, the future for light duty vehicle sector is electric, right? Like even electric versus hydrogen fuel cell, like battery electric versus hydrogen. I feel like that debate is basically pretty much finalized, or the jury is not still out on that. We have pretty good clarity on the direction for the sector. But there's an argument that's usually a question that's usually raised, and it's actually a really good question, I think, which is that, is there not worth in funding certain measures that can be purely for an emission reduction measure, understanding that it's not going to lead to a net zero, but because climate scientists tell us that the time and the cumulative emissions matter, right? So in terms of the actual value of emission reduction today is quite more important, or it's much more valuable, sort of discounted value of 20 years from now, we can reduce X versus what we can reduce today. So wouldn't we want to lower GHGs as rapidly as possible? And can't ethanol blending with gasoline help with that?
So yeah, I agree. That's a good question. So here we're thinking about, we admit, it's not helping the transition to the real solution, but at least it could get our emissions down a little bit in the short term. Maybe that argument might have made sense 20 years ago or something. It doesn't make any sense for the example that we're looking here about ethanol blending in gasoline today. I mean, two reasons. One is the scale of investment that we've been putting into this ethanol infrastructure, subsidizing processing facilities and various things. All that is resources that could have been put to accelerate vehicle electrification, build out charging stations, or whatever. But the other thing to realize is just how small the reduction is that you get from this type of blending activity. I think I have a slide there, Mo, that you could put up. But first thing you realize is a 10% ethanol blend only reduces emissions maybe by 5%. And again, as the vehicle fleet turns over, the impact is less and less. So this is a a chart. Thanks to Claire Cameron for preparing this. And it's showing the turnover of the vehicle fleet over time to 2050, and it's calibrated on the federal sales targets for EVs. And what you see is that right now the ethanol blending maybe achieves, something like, I don't know, 2/3 or something of emissions reduction. But very quickly, as the vehicle fleet turns over, it reduces and becomes, a trivial amount in the overall contribution. I should just say that this chart is based on 20% ethanol blending, which doesn't exist. Most Canadian provinces maybe 10%, but some don't have other clear mandates and so on. So we're well below 10% now. And I picked the 20% slide because the blue bar was so teensy on the 10%, which we're still aspiring to, that you couldn't see it clearly. So it just shows this really doesn't make much of a significant impact on the problem, and it's a distraction. The other thing I would say is that this ethanol blending has had other problems. I mean, really, I would say over quite a long time, it served as a surrogate for governments to kind of avoid taking action that would dramatically affect emissions. I think there are other kinds of problems that it had. It's been, it's, as I say, it's kind of politically acceptable. It's maybe appealed to some farmers, but it has had some bad impact. So there's some evidence that it's impacted corn prices so it's above all research in the US that shows that this production has impacted corn prices and also food prices more generally, as well as having climate and environmental problems, because corn has particularly requires lots of fertilizer, which is increased emissions in this sector as well. So for all of those reasons, I don't think it's a particularly good policy, even if you've agreed with me that it's a dead end in terms of actually transforming the system and getting to a state where we can move towards net zero emissions.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, James. And I think this graph really quantitatively shows that logic where if you just don't have numbers, you may be sort of persuaded by saying like, oh yeah, this is going to be still better than nothing. But then you can see really the trade-offs, right? Because essentially what you're saying too, James, like if we're trying to invest to 20% ethanol too, it's going to take a lot more capital, which that capital could be deployed to realize that green that we're seeing here in the graph.
Yeah, and it's just a big diffusion of efforts, distraction of what people should be focusing on, and so on. And in this case, ruling out these dead-end pathways is a great aid to the markets to show the directionality of the movement and the change required.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing I wanted to ask about, because, blending ethanol in gasoline, we've characterized as that a dead end. But we've heard, and this is some of the work that we've done at Transition Accelerator, thinking about hydrogen blending with diesel for trucks. What about that?
So that's a kind of interesting case because it looks exactly the same as the ethanol blending, but not quite. And that's because potentially hydrogen, if it's produced in a net zero framework, could be a fuel and could be deployed at scale in the heavy duty transport sector. Now, it wouldn't be as a fuel in the sense that you would combust it. It would most likely be as a fuel cell. The problem is when you're thinking about how do we actually scale this, there are not very many fuel cell trucks. They're hard to come by. There are not the fueling infrastructure. And of course, the hydrogen itself may not be particularly low emission at the present time. So you face a whole bunch of barriers that you're trying to overcome in order to build out such a system step by step. And particularly work on fueling stations, showing that if you can get a hydrogen fueling station that is fueling some trucks that are on fuel cells already, but some that are just blended in gasoline, it helps get the economics better for those fueling stations, which are required if you're going to build out the fuel cell option at scale. So it could be a stepping stone in the building of a pathway that is robust to net zero, but it's a stepping stone. And of course, your idea is to get those internal combustion trucks off the road as fast as possible and move up the fuel cell ramp on the S curve.
Yeah, and I think this kind of points out something that you talk about quite a bit, which is that we don't have to do everything all at once, right? Like not everything has to simultaneously emerge out of thin air, which is like infrastructure, vehicles, everything at the same time. So essentially, what you're saying that this could enable infrastructure investments that can actually be assets for a net zero compatible pathway, which is hydrogen fuel cell trucks.
Yes, exactly. And I think that more general point that you made about not doing everything at once, really people, it's kind of a simple thing in a way, but people have trouble with it. So when you discuss electric vehicles, people say, oh yeah, but some provinces, the grid is still dirty, or how do we dispose of the batteries afterwards? Or miners will be, getting critical minerals, we're going to run out, or they come from, conflict societies. So the point is there's a whole mass of problems, but every problem doesn't have to be solved simultaneously in that, we're going to need more electricity to power the electric cars. We're going to need to clean up the grid. But, even if we sell as many electric cars as we possibly can today, we're not going to break the grid. We're going to, because we have, years basically to add capacity, incrementally build transmission or storage or things like that. And it's the same kind of thing. One needs to think strategically. Where do you want to go? And is this step part of a movement of the whole system, or could it be? Or is it just, delaying the investment in the area that we actually need?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, James. So we have a lot of questions here, so I'll finish up my part, and then we'll get to some of the quite really good questions in the Q&A. We touched upon like biofuel a bit. I mean, some may say that you've been very negative on biofuels, and and I think we need to kind of clarify for some people that are working with us or that are interacting with our content. What do you think about biofuels broadly, and are they dead end across the board?
No, definitely not. And I think it's clear that in the net zero energy system, there will need to be a variety of net zero energy carriers, and biofuels can particularly play that role. And more generally, the whole biomass thing may be important also for negative emissions and so on. So I'm not at all attacking the biofuels industry or, just junking the whole thing. But the question is that biological resources are actually, scarce, if you like, and we're going to have to decide how are we going to allocate them to the highest value areas. And so, for an example, aviation fuel is a thing that most people think, because other alternative for aviation are still much further in the future. That's an area where biofuels might contribute, and also there are other areas of the bioeconomy, drugs, chemical feedstock. There are lots of other areas where it may be more important than light duty vehicles. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good Good point, James. And I think ultimately there, like the way that I think about it, you know, there are problems like you mentioned, like for right now battery electric vehicles as a net zero pathway. There's like if you look at the lifetime emissions, there's still lingering emissions there, even if you depending on where you live, the access to the grid that you have, depending where the battery source, all of that. But all those problems, like there's nothing fundamentally stopping you from solving them, right? Like there are solutions that you can imagine and you can implement, and policies and regulations on recycling and all of that. But I think the case of biofuel, scalability, the scarcity of like laws of physics that you have, like that's where I feel like we need to kind of distinguish between a challenging pathway and a dead end pathway, right? And does that make sense?
Yeah, no, agree totally. And the solutions to these problems will be able to unfold over time. And the most pressing ones we'll try to address first, I think, from a societal point of view.
Yeah, like there's nothing fundamentally stopping us from improving our mining practices, for example, right? To then reduce the lifetime emissions of batteries.
Yes. I mean, all I can say is, yes, I agree with you. There is nothing fundamental. Of course, saying there isn't anything that fundamentally that stops us is really different than actually doing it and solving the problem.
Yes,
and it's going to require research, effort, significant investment, and time to gradually overcome all those other hurdles. Yeah.
I mean, so on that, kind of to wrap it up, what can governments do to avoid committing to enabling these dead-end pathways and wasted resources, as you kind of highlighted?
So I mean, there's no magic solution to this, because transitions are complicated. We're going to make mistakes. Things will look good, and then we'll realize they're not so good, or whatever. A horse will come from behind and things like that. But I would say kind of three simple, things. The first thing is we need some analysis, and we need to understand where do we want to go. Of course, we can't tell all the details of what a net zero society would look like, but we already know some of the big things. Electricity, for instance, which we know lots of ways to make it net zero, is going to take much more of the end use energy load in vehicles, in buildings, in industry, and so on. And there are other things like that, at the high level that we know, but we need to really start from that. In other words, we need to know where to go if we're going to define pathways. Otherwise, pathways can go off a cliff or lead to a dead end. You've got to think both where we are and where we want to go, and distinguish what's more likely and more able or less able to move us towards the system level change. Secondly, I would say where the solutions are clear. So we've talked about EV, but also developing the electricity system, and so on, both building it out and decarbonizing where it isn't. The things that we know how to do, we really need to put the money and the focus of attention of planning, regulations, regulatory authorities on those things, and not tear our hair about the things that are less certain. So priorities. Push the things we really know, and stop pouring money down things that, if we do the analysis, we realize can't really work.
Okay, well, that's really great, James. Really, I think that's having a vision, knowing where the future, or basically vision for the future, is the first step. I agree 100%. And I think you talked a lot about that in terms of about transition pathways. So I want to shamelessly plug some of your work here, which is one of the courses that you developed called NetZero Changes Everything: A Strategic Approach. So it's a live course that you give that puts sort of the latest understanding of the net zero transition into people's kind of knowledge and understanding of that. So we have we have the course on a monthly basis with like discounts available for private groups. And really the goal is to make sure that governments, industry, civil society are equipped with the kind of knowledge and the tools. So you got to really very tiny sample here of James' brilliance on this topic. So please reach out to us to find out more, and we'll have links in the chat. But yeah, so James, I know you get into a lot more details in the course there, and it's a very much interactive approach. So I think maybe some folks on the audience might really appreciate that. So we have a lot of questions, James. Some of them are quite interesting. So I'll kind of kick us off here for the remainder of the time. Really appreciate the conversation. So one of the questions is direct air capture. Where does it sit on the continuum of priority, potential, and dead end?
Okay, so I should just say that I have not made a exhaustive list of all possible technologies and approaches, and so I would say this. I think that direct air capture it's an interesting technology that we may well need to use at some point in the future. We know that it works. The techniques that are being done can work, but it's very pricey. And the question is, very much at what scale could that technology be deployed at some unknown point in the future in order to really make a difference? So I would not characterize it as a dead end pathway in the sense that I don't think investment in it is necessarily wasted. I would not put it at the core of our climate efforts, i.e., if you're allocating your $10 across technologies, I wouldn't give direct air capture 9 because it's very expensive. And the critical thing, I think, is, and again, everybody agrees on this from international climate expertise, that what we have to do first is get our sectors down to zero as quickly as possible. And maybe direct air capture will be useful in mopping up the residual emissions that are really hard to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the idea. It's like it's a dead end pathway if you think it's gonna, like, we can just continue to do whatever we want and we're just gonna capture carbon from the air and we don't have to do anything.
If someone's proposing it as a universal solution to climate change, then I would suggest it's not.
But in terms of like a contributing solution to getting negative emissions, I think the fact is, like as you said, we're going to need negative emissions. Like we're going to get near zero, and some sectors are going to be more challenging. And on a similar light, there's a question about carbon capture and utilization and storage.
So again, I think CCS is a technology that can be a useful contributor to solutions. If you think you're going to solve the problem and we're going to run the world on fossil fuels with CCS, I think you're going to be disappointed. Again, you often hear people say CCS doesn't work. Well, it does work. It's expensive and it doesn't capture all the emissions. So you would need, in a net zero world, you'd need to combine, if you were doing CCS on a gas power plant or I don't know what, or a steel plant or something, you would need to combine it with some form of negative emissions as well. But again, I wouldn't class CCS as a technology that way. But someone could suggest a use for CCS that is a complete dead end. So here, let me say that I think using CCS on bitumen production to make hydrogen for bitumen is not going to get us, to net zero, because it's not building the new energy system that we need for transition. On the other hand, if you're using, CCS on hydrogen production because you want to use the hydrogen for a new energy economy, then it looks slightly differently. So it's not just the technology in an abstract, it's what you're planning to do with it that helps you decide whether it's a wasted social investment or not. Yeah.
What's like you said, it goes back to your vision and knowing what the system, like planning for that system and understanding where you want to go, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we have a lot of questions. I'm trying to like select ones here that are that are interesting, and that we can kind of, some of them we've covered throughout the presentation. So I think the idea of the regional differences and resource availability and cost, and how that account for dead end pathways. And I think I have my thoughts, but kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Could you repeat that, Mo? That one wasn't quite clear to me.
So basically looking at the regional difference, like, are there regional differences in identifying whether something is a dead end or not in terms of resource availability and cost?
I mean, I think you could apply it at a regional level in particular circumstances, but since I kind of stick with the idea of thinking about dead end in terms of its fundamental ability to resolve the question rather than just relative cost, I kind of think most of the dead end things we're identifying as a dead end pathway, if they really are a dead end, then they're a dead end more generally. Yeah. I should just comment on the CCUS thing. I'm very skeptical about the U part of the thing. It used to be CCS, and then we've inserted the U part. And I think the U has the utilization part. You really have to think what that utilization is. Is it contributing to permanent capture or just keeping CO2 to do some other use and then ultimately releasing it and things like that? So I think those are also, things to consider there.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I guess one question is an interesting one. Who should be allowed to identify dead end pathways? Governments are going to get a huge pushback from industry by declaring certain things dead end. I guess that's the question.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no thing like, like other things, there's no thing where you need a license to be able to, only authorized experts can declare something like this. I mean, obviously, it's socially, it's going to be socially contested. And there may be things that I say that I think are dead end pathways that other people are going to say, oh, no, we can do that, and so on. So there's going to be a give and take about it. I think in practice, governments do decide what they're going to invest in and what they don't invest in. And I think, yeah, sure, interest groups that have money sunk in one technology or another are going to say, oh, give us money. But right now, that's exactly what's happening. Everybody has their hand out. We want to be included on the tax subsidy, tax allowances, or we want to get subsidies or things like that. So, yeah. And let me just say that this dead end pathways is a specific issue. I don't think we should be spending most of our time running around with a magnifying glass trying to find dead ends. I mean, mostly it should be the other way. We should be defining what are the visions of what can deliver on net zero and what are the specific elements we need to bring into existence to get there. So we mostly should be worried about what are the priority pathways, what are the pathways with most potential.
Yeah, which folks can explore more on the course if people are interested, or other webinars, because the webinar series is pathways to net zero. One question is on the building sector. Given that the residential hybrid heat pumps that rely on fossil fuels on colder days can last 20 years or more, and they ensure the continued investment in gas infrastructure and delay the investments and electricity grid infrastructure, plus smart technologies that reduce system peaks. Would you classify that as a dead end? And if not, why not? So basically asking about hybrid natural gas heat pump systems.
So I'm a bit hesitant to get drawn into like really specific technologies. And what I would say is I don't think that's a solution at scale, because it can't go all the way to net zero. And I think that we need to get natural gas out of Canadian homes if we're going to, and buildings, if we're going to deal with, those GHG emissions and meet any kind of climate target. At the moment, electrification is the most straightforward way to do this, particularly using heat pumps. Ultimately, biogas is not a scalable solution for all of the buildings in Canada. Hydrogen, I think, could make a contribution. It's just not there yet because you can't go out and buy a hydrogen-ready furnace, and you can't plug in to a hydrogen grid anywhere. So if you want to do something for the next, I don't know, 5 years, decade, it's electrification is the most straightforward way. Could there be contexts in which the hybrids like you discuss could be useful? There could be, but they aren't going to get you all the way.
Yeah. That's a good question, a good answer, James. I'm going to keep rolling here. One question on it's a little bit focused on the priority pathway, but I think it's an interesting sector that I know you've been looking into over the last year or so, is on the on the agriculture sector. How would what are some priority pathways for the agriculture sector to net zero? And I know it's a very challenging sector, but I know you have some initial thoughts that maybe we can share here.
So my personal view is that agriculture is maybe the most difficult sector, large-scale sector to deal with. I know people often talk about big trucks or cement or something or steel as the difficult to decarbonize sectors, and of course they pose many challenges. But ultimately, I think there are technologies and approaches that are being discussed in those sectors that seem kind of quite feasible. I think one of the problems with agriculture is the emissions are really baked into the current structure of the agricultural system, particularly the relative importance of animal agriculture and the use of fertilizers. And the use of fertilizers is really important. I mean, you can say that something like the nitrogen, the half the world's population wouldn't be there today, or we wouldn't be able to sustain them if it wasn't for nitrogen fertilizers, because the nitrogen in people's bodies actually has come from chemical from artificially synthetic nitrogen. So there are lots of things we can do. You could, change the feed of animals, of beef, so that they have less enteric emissions. You can play with the genetics. You can get better manure management practices. You can change field agricultural practices so that you need less chemical fertilizers. You can do intercropping, and you can do reduce till or no till, and so on and so on. You can also ultimately change what we produce and what we eat. So you could reduce the amount of calories in diets that come from animal agriculture. And of course, the Canadian agricultural system is linked into what's happening more internationally. The question is that they're not simple, scalable solutions that you can do everywhere, and we don't yet know enough about how to actually bring that about. So if you think about EVs, kind of will work for light duty vehicles, and it's the same in China as it is, in Canada. Agriculture varies enormously according to the region, the soil, the crop, and the emissions. For instance, nitrogen emissions vary with all sorts of things, including the weather, the soil type. So we know lots of things we can do, but yet not fully vision of what a net zero agricultural system will look like. I'm hesitant so I can tell you this won't scale, but it could be part of something. But since it's still unclear the configuration of that final vision, I wouldn't say more than that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I know that people, kind of start to have other things now, but a couple more questions, James. I know that you don't want to really get into the technologies, but I think one that is important to at least clarify, and I think you touched upon it quickly before, is this the blue hydrogen and whether that's a dead end or not? And that's a question that we had from the audience.
Yeah, so there are various ways of, making hydrogen and imagining how you could make it at scale. Obviously, hydrogen made through electrolysis from renewable energy or made directly from renewable energy, which is a technology that's still, 20 years out, would, is, can be net zero and is desirable. What people describe as blue hydrogen is made from a fossil fuel input, then with CCS. The CCS couldn't capture it all, and depending which fossil fuel you used, you might have fugitive emissions from methane or things like that. So ultimately, if a blue hydrogen is to carry on into a net zero world, it would need it would need to be associated with negative emissions practices. You see lots of research about what would be the cost of actually doing this, and I mean authentically net zero. I don't mean like fuzzy accounting that makes it look net zero. It isn't. But I find it very hard to be certain about those cost estimates either way, some of which say it's absolutely impossible in principle. I don't believe that. Impossible in principle, but it might be very expensive. So what scale of blue hydrogen could possibly be continued in a net zero world? I don't know. Could it serve as a stepping stone to build out the hydrogen economy before we can get electrolyzers in a cost competitive way? That is quite possible. So I wouldn't say now condemn blue hydrogen projects and so on the basis of that, in 2060, can they get the emissions down completely? So again, that could be a stepping stone. So I'm not going to write that off as a dead end.
Okay. And then I know you have some thoughts on blending hydrogen in the gas distribution for heating.
Sorry, could you repeat that one?
Blending hydrogen for heating.
Yeah, so the problem with blending hydrogen for building heating is that you can only go so far. I've read figures that suggest you might be able to go to 20% before you start to have problems with the pipeline and the existing infrastructure and stuff like that. And currently, gas companies are talking in Canada about just a few percentages to get some experience with hydrogen. I don't think the blending doesn't solve the problem at scale. It could be a step if you need to do some experiments with the distribution system or learning how to manage hydrogen or things like that. But it seems to me very strange to think we're going to get the whole gas network up to 20% hydrogen when there's a whole bunch of infrastructure investments you'd need to get to fully hydrogen. But again, I think this may be regional specific, as I said, and it may depend on the rate at which hydrogen is developed, both the supply of clean hydrogen and also the making clear the infrastructure investments that would be needed if you actually wanted to move buildings in a particular region or district or city or whatever to hydrogen. That's why I say, for now, hydrogen remains hypothetical. It's a potential pathway. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, James. So I know we've been going on a bunch of questions here. There's a lot of the questions are technology specific, which I know you don't really want to get into too much. But so any kind of final thoughts before I wrap us up?
Yeah, I'm just scrolling through all these questions. So the point is, there are a zillion questions, and it's really interesting. Thank you for all of you who've taken time to put things in the chat, and we will look at the chat afterwards, I think, and see, if there's some things that we can dig into further. No, I don't think I have further thoughts. I think I'm pretty good. Anyway, thank you, people, for joining. And obviously, it's a complex an important question, and we really welcome the dialogue with people around these issues.
Yeah, thank you, James. And as I mentioned, again, there's the NetZero Changes Everything course with James, and it's a very interactive course. You get to spend 6 hours with James, which is great, and encourage you to kind of look into that. Before we wrap up today, I also like to take the opportunity to talk about our 2024 Net Zero Forum. So this is going to be hosted by us in May of 2024, May 14th, 15th. And it's a gathering of a select group. So this is going to be limited seating or limited number of attendees to try to weave together the complexity of the transition, as James was mentioning, to talk about the different aspects of decarbonization and present that system-wide perspective on pathways to net zero, going through sectors and then bringing them together and understanding really it's really not just about like discussions or thinking about what are the next step, but it's about really practical actions and strategies, as James mentioned, rooted in this approach of pathways, right? So it's really emphasize the forum is not going to be just another conference. Like we're trying to really proactively design it in a way that emphasizes dialogue, shared learning, interactivity. Want it also to be fun. So it's hopefully you will really enjoy it if you attend, and it won't be like any other event you've attended. We can promise that. So we basically have, as I mentioned, limited space for the event. So we urge you to register your interest, and we'll drop a link in the chat as we kind of go through the process between now and the next few months to reach out to interested parties as we try to kind of have limited seating that is really tailored to diversifying the voices that we have to, as I mentioned, increase and augment the dialogue on this idea of a system-wide pathway to net zero perspective. So with that, I'll really thankful for everybody who stuck around even a little bit past the top of the hour, and appreciate your participation in these webinars. We have a couple more webinars coming up soon. Some questions on direct air capture came up. We have a webinar coming up on the 7th of December as well, which I think was put in the chat. So if the folks are interested in that, feel free to attend. So again, thank you so a lot, James. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure to talk to you about these not very easy topics, I know, but and thanks for everyone who helped organize it. And thanks for Jane McDonald, who opened this up this afternoon. So thank you.